What's up, everybody? Welcome to Chapter 6 of the Modern Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Mahfouz Chowdhury, and I'm here with my incredible co host, Camille. And we're really excited to welcome you back for yet another conversation. We're 5 episodes deep, so if you haven't already listened to any of our 5 episodes previously, I recommend shortly after this episode to jump on in and get it started. It's interesting that we, although we commit to our Sunday schedule, that sometimes our live recording dates varies, and it varies quite significantly, right? Like sometimes it'll be at early morning 10 a.m. and here we are today for I think the second time this season doing an 8 p.m. recording. What is your feeling about that? Do you notice any difference either within yourself or the way that the podcast show happens when you do an early morning recording versus an evening one?
I think it's just the caffeine wears off, so I feel a little bit tired, and I hope that when I watch the episodes back, it's not that bad. As considering to what I feel in the moment as I'm speaking, but what also you'll notice is if we're recording at night, I'm wearing my blue light blocking glasses. So that's the way you'll find out if we're actually recording at night if you don't join us for the stream. And to be honest, it's just it's just a part of life. So we are flexible and we're accommodating to each other's schedule as well. And I think that's also important for what we're talking about, which is to actually live life and to think about what you learn from the experiences instead of trying to force yourself to do things just strictly out of the routine of doing it. It's about recognizing that it's not going to be constant and there are going to be things that are constantly shifting as well, and you just have to learn how to deal with it and manage. Right, we're still hitting our goals of the once a week, and we're still being consistent with our delivery and with our output, so I don't see a problem with it.
We often talk about action over perfection as well, right? And it's the fact that it's not about having the perfect plan in your execution in order to bring something to life, but also sometimes the fact that you're going to have imperfect days. Some of your quality of your days will not be as better as the other, but at the end of the day, it's like, did you make one step closer to the goal that you wanted to? Did you get 1% better than who you were? And if you start seeing that result happen as a result of those imperfect days, you'll actually be okay with the fact that not all days will be perfect and line up. But I love that emphasis on like working these things into your lifestyle and like not converting your entire lifestyle for those things, really finding a way to bring those commonalities so that it does accommodate the way of being. And this is going to be a really fun conversation, something that I think off camera and off microphone, you and I do a lot of, which is every single time we get together, we spend some time talking about past memories, and then we don't just let that memory fall off. We kind of spend some time digging into that memory. I almost feel like we have a virtual pickaxe and we're just kind of going at it until we get as much as we can out of it. And then we put that memory away and usually feeling better, or we feel like we have a better way of thinking due to the fact that we spent enough time on it, which is why I think it's so perfect that today's episode focused specifically on better reflections. And I was thinking about this when our topic of the day came to mind, better reflections, which I would say is probably a long distant cousin to better awareness. Right? We talked about better awareness last week, and I was kind of asking myself, I was like, what is the difference? Like, why didn't we just kind of package all the better reflection topics into better awareness? And I was scrambling a little bit of that, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Like better awareness, in many ways, from my perspective, I kind of think of it as like, having being intentional about your being, right? And being intentional about your being does require some level of reflection, but isn't necessarily the same thing. What are your thoughts on that? Like the difference between the two and why you think they should have been two?
Well, I think specifically with better awareness, of course, it's strictly just about better reflections versus better awareness. You can argue that awareness is about present and then reflections is about past, but they do have some crossover too. So I think it is actually being more, as they say, like objective, but that's not the right word. It's being more mindful. Both of them have that commonality because with the reflections that you share and that you experience, you have to be kind of mindful to the whole situation and be detached from who you were in the moment. Because in the moment you could be feeling all these things, whereas better awareness can also be the same thing, but it's almost in a meditative kind of way, and it's hard and it's almost impossible to be in that mode all the time. Where in better reflections, it's so much easier because you're doing a playback as opposed to actually being in the moment when you have that stimulus that elicits that emotion that can overtake your sense of being, right? The sense that you want to be in the moment is so hard to attain when you're upset or when you're uncomfortable. And when you reflect on it, you can still have those emotions, but they're not as intense. So I think they are almost one and the same, at least in the way that we both approach it, or at least in the way I approach it. Uh, it's more that one is more past tense than present tense.
Yeah, the present and past comparison, I think, is an interesting perspective. I didn't even think of it that way until you kind of described it. And I think the awareness is also um, past in relative to your future as well, right? It's like what you do next. You kind of have to instantly be aware of that. So it's like constantly being aware of each action that's building up to what's going to be your future, which you could argue that it's always in the present because you're thinking about the circumstance that you're in as you're developing your future every single day. So it does get really, really interesting there. I was thinking about our topic of the day today. The irony is I was reflecting on better reflections, and I was thinking about like where my mind takes me, which is a really fun thing to do sometimes because it surprises you where your mind goes. And it resulted in me actually doing a write up for my Instagram post that I did a couple of hours ago. And I wrote this caption as it was going through my mind. I said, if you spend enough time reflecting on how you got your biggest wins, you will truly believe that your hardest times often lead to the greatest moments of your life. Grow through those tough situations. And it was interesting because when I started thinking about that, and when I did the write up, my mind kind of started drifting towards my biggest wins. I was thinking about what a win means to me, which is also worth saying that a win can mean different things to different people, right? Sometimes it might be materialistic things. Sometimes it might be an achievement that you had. Sometimes it's just a good feeling or a good day. Whatever a win is to you, it was really that reminder that when you start reflecting enough on how that win came to be, it kind of goes beyond the idea of the fact that you don't just think of the win as an outcome. You start thinking of it as the journey that led to the outcome. And when you start thinking about the journey, you start realizing that not every step of that journey was a good step forward. Sometimes it was a step back. Sometimes it was at a complete halt. Sometimes there were days where you didn't see how the circumstance you were going through is going to play out into the win that you had when you were currently living it. The more time you spend in that area where you're paying attention to the journey of ups and downs, you really start to embrace that there is a potential every single time something goes wrong that it's setting you up for something better. And I used to see those motivational quotes sometimes, right? Like, every bad day is going to lead to a great day kind of thing. And it never really made sense to me. And sometimes when something becomes so cliche, I start thinking to myself, like, why? Why is it cliche? Like, why is it a lot of people are saying this? And when I start diving into it, I really understand that those experiences that we have start putting some truth behind those cliche statements. And the truth that I came to realize was the fact that every single thing I had. So when I think of my career win of what I've been able to achieve in my career, I think a lot of it came down to my experience of breaking out of a conservative, strict family household and really trying to identify the things that I want to do and pursue my passion. And I also started thinking about how if I didn't go through academic probation when I was at university, the opportunity that I currently capitalize on wouldn't have existed if I graduated when I was supposed to. So your mind starts really thinking a lot about what a success versus failure means. And also the fact that failure no longer gets seen as the opposite of success. It's actually in the same family. It's one of the ground pieces, one of the fundamental pieces that are necessary for that piece of success or win to happen. And it really started shifting my perspective. And I spent a lot of time reflecting on that. And I know you quite well as well. And I know you and I talk about a lot of things that happen in your life based on something going really, really wrong. And my mind's kind of been thinking a lot about how to have that optimism and have to how to have that mentality around a bad day to not actually get turned off by it, but staying more level headed and staying more optimistic about the fact that it could lead into something better.
Yeah, it's difficult, especially when you're having the bad day, to actually appreciate it. Because you can come up with all sorts of reasons as to why this time is different, or that you're falling into the same pattern once again, and that you feel that as though all the work you put in only leads to the same outcome, which is that bad day. But you don't realize that all the work you put in also puts you in that good day, or in those wins as you describe. And I feel as though it's getting more and more accepted that making mistakes and forgetting and not being perfect is all a part of learning and becoming to become better as a person, or more efficient, more proficient in whatever you want to be. And what I find when I'm having the bad days is the best part is I know it's temporary because it's a bad day. And if it happens simultaneously, like in a row, these bad days in a bad week, then I know it's a bad week. But those that label that I attach to it is temporary. It's ephemeral. It's a time based thing. So I can always see that as temporary. The downside to that is recognizing that, the wins, the happiness is also temporary. But that's also something you should be excited by, because if you're happy forever, you'll never appreciate it. In the same way that if you're sad forever, you won't recognize it at all. You'll be suffering in eternity, and it will just become your new normal. So I think that's what makes life so great, is that you have these highs and lows, and then you can contrast them. And we naturally are comparative, but as we're probably going to talk about, how comparison is not the best way to go about reflections, that because of that contrast, we can learn to appreciate the highs and lows, and then we can actually be able to look back and recognize that these lows were necessary for that. And if you study neuroscience or even psychology and social psychology, it's becoming more and more accepted that forgetting is a very important part of learning. And making mistakes actually makes you learn skills faster, especially motor skills. People that are musicians, probably athletes as well, anyone that practices martial arts, or anyone that practices any sort of repetitive motor movement when it comes to kicking a soccer ball the right way. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, but then those mistakes will cause you to adjust, provided that you are having the better awareness techniques that we described with the last episode, that you are aware and present in the moment and conscious with the motions that you're doing. Over time, if you recognize those mistakes, what happens in your brain is you get that frustration, you get that emotion. Because if you have the apathy, you don't feel anything, you're not motivated to go on that task. But as soon as you make a mistake, there's that little part in your brain that's like, why am I making that mistake? Why am I frustrated? This is so annoying. I should either quit or do something else. And if you stick with that and you keep going despite your urge to just stop because it's uncomfortable, you can adjust. And when you adjust, you get closer to your goal. And that's the best way to learn. And that's why when you practice music, like if I'm practicing guitar, what was taught to me 10 years ago is a lot different than the science that's taught now. And the science back then was you practice as slow as possible to have that perfect technique. And once you have that perfect technique down, you practice maybe 4 or 5 times, then you up the tempo just by a very minimal amount. And as soon as you hit the tempo where you make a single mistake, you revert back to a little bit below, and you keep pushing that boundary eventually. And what the science shows now is that that is actually inefficient. What you should be doing is challenge yourself very frequently and trying to go as fast as possible. Of course, still provided the main technique and reverting back when you need to. When you don't have the technique, when you don't have the proper notes in succession, when you don't practice those good habits, then you should go back. But the point is that you have to challenge yourself, and by challenging yourself, you're bound to make mistakes, and you have to recognize those mistakes are crucial for learning. And I think that goes with life and with reflections as well. Once you recognize that having a bad day is part of becoming a good day and learning how to appreciate the good day and getting those good days again, then you can start seeing them in a different light.
So much good stuff there, man. I love the emphasis on the fact that you almost get numb to the feeling of an experience if you don't feel the opposite spectrum of things not working out, right? Like you really start appreciating the better days because of the bad days, and you start appreciating getting out of a bad day because of those better days, and having that balance really builds that excitement. I think that's such a good perspective. The thought that I had as you were kind of saying, like the comparison component, and maybe that's not the best way to reflect. I think there is a lot of opportunities in the areas of bringing in comparisons for the right reasons, but there's unfortunately a very, very nasty, dark underbelly of comparison that most people fall into, which is the idea of letting comparison become the thief of their happiness, right? Like things are going good in their life, but they don't see it because someone just seems to be having something that is in a larger magnitude. And as a result of that comparison, all of a sudden they don't feel as happy about it. I was having this conversation with a group of people yesterday, and I was talking about what 1,300 followers could mean to someone, right? Because one of the individuals in the group was talking about the 1,300 followers, and she wasn't very excited about it. But I drew out a perspective where I said, like, imagine like 100 people just hanging around your house right now, right? Like just 100 people, because it's easier to imagine. Like imagine they're just hanging around your driveway. I'm like, how big does that look? And like imagine like they're all paying attention every single time you want to share something like a piece of art or your creativity. But then I was like, and then multiply that by 13. Like just imagine how many people are in that neighborhood. Like your neighborhood probably couldn't even contain that many people, and they'd probably call the police because there's too much people blocking the way. But because you see that someone else has 5,000 or 8,000, you start using that as a reflection that tells the story in your head, which is the fact that what you did is not enough. Rather than appreciating the fact that you have that many people that really can be that really feels and connects with your messaging or your creativity every single day, and that you can really make meaningful impact with that perspective. And I think that when you start bringing in that level of toxic comparison, it really does become the component that makes you look at wins as not wins, and sometimes look at wins as losses because it just doesn't seem big enough. And that part of comparison gets scary. Where comparison gets really excited to me is a perfect tie to what we talked about with better conversations, is the fact that you don't have to experience those you don't have to have those metrics or the past or the reflections in order to be able to grow from it. You can actually very much grow from other people's experiences if those conversations are happening. You can start reflecting on someone else's backstory and someone else's wins and losses and someone else's advice and why they came to that advice, or someone else's family, household, religion, all these things that maybe you don't have familiarity with. You can all of a sudden feel like, wow, there's something more out there in the world that I know nothing about. And first and foremost, that really humbles you. The more out there the other person's reflection is, the more you realize how little you know. And the more you start realizing how little you know, you start getting an understanding with humility that maybe there's a lot more you can take in. And that gets you a lot more attentive when you're in these conversations, because now you're really curious about what it is that you haven't experienced and what comes out of that perspective, which is why I very much enjoy having these conversations with you. We've done 5 chapters, and I've gone back and we listened to all of them, and sometimes multiple times, because there's always something that was interesting in those episodes that makes me think just a little bit differently. And I think if that happens every single episode, who I could be by the end of the season, right? And it's fascinating because we create this for the sake of our audience, hoping they get value, but I can't even begin to explain to you how many times I get inspired and how many times it almost modifies my way of thinking or makes me dig in a little bit more with curiosity based on something that you say. And that to me is one of the most valuable things about doing this podcast with you. I have to say, is that growth that comes out of your reflection. I was telling you just before we started our recording that I went out and experienced Electric Island for the first time yesterday, and I feel like I really waited way too long to finally try out Electric Island for the first time. But I figured, in the spirit of having better experiences, I figured it was a good opportunity for me to try a new experience. What was the most fascinating thing about that event, aside from how fun it was simply the fact that when I was there, looking around and seeing all the individuals that were there at this festival, at this rave type environment, you kind of get to see like multiple free spirited people with their own personalities and stories. And you can recognize that immediately because some of the costumes and the way that they dress is so outrageous based on what you're used to seeing. So you kind of get curious about like, why are they the way they are? Who are they? What did they experience in their life that I haven't experienced? And what I got really interested in was kind of moving away from the music once in a while and sitting down and chatting it up with some people that were at that festival. And I can't even begin to tell you how inspired I was just by listening to their backstories of the challenges that they have, where they came from, sometimes different countries, sometimes a very dark place. And you become very grateful that you didn't have to experience that yourself. And you become even more grateful that you were able to grow through their reflection as if you did experience it yourself. And I thought that level of comparison got really exciting for me. And then there's also the comparison of comparing with yourself, right? And you kind of talked about this with the guitar component by challenging yourself. I think the challenging part definitely makes sense. And then where there's the added value is when you compare to how much better you got based on the fact that you reflected on who you used to be versus who you are. It gives you that feeling of growth. It gives you that feeling of possibility. Sometimes you don't think it's possible to get that good, but even if you get a little bit better, you now think there is hope. So you get a little bit more optimistic about that adventure. I think that level of conversation around comparison, I wish happened a lot more. And this is one of the most underspoken item and opportunity that came out of the internet is the fact that you can go on any given day and find reflections on literally any experience or any topic and just learn from it. And you don't have to agree with everything. You don't necessarily have to subscribe to it or even let it change the way you think, but there might be enough to make you look in further. There might be enough to ask better questions. There might be enough to bring back to your circle of friends and talk about it more. And as we said, with our pickaxe, we're going at it and seeing what we can pull out of that. I think that's where that level of comparison and conversations get really fascinating.
Yeah, I do too, and I had to come back to that point that you were mentioning as well because I do grow a lot from our conversations as well, and I do, even though that we talk a lot, off camera and then on camera, it's still amazing that even with these new conversations that we have that seem like old ones, there's still a lot that we learn from, and especially the fact that we're both on camera, so at least for me it's different in the way that I approach conversation because I try my best to be more coherent where maybe off camera I'm more off on tangents and it's hard for me to actually stay on topic or stay within a certain path. I'm still amazed at what we learn from, at least what I learned from as well. So I wanted to express that before commenting on that because I think as well it's amazing to talk to people that have had open and honest reflections about that, and I find the people that I learn the most from are the ones that are conscious, at least in what they do, and actually have that skill of being present within the moment and being aware of what's going on, at least within themselves as well as the situation. And that's a very tough thing to do. I can't imagine what it's like, especially when you have such a stressful moment, and to be like focused on the moment and then focused on what you're feeling as well is very difficult. And then somehow being able to detach from that and doing that consciously, and that's a whole nother layer to that. And at the same time too, you don't have to put yourself through that stressful situation. In fact, like you mentioned before, since the advent of the internet, we are pretty much exposed to whatever we want to look at. Hell, I was even watching the videos of what was it, like ex special forces commenting on home invasion videos, and that's something that I would never dare to experience, yet I can have those reflections on his awareness of the experience that he is having, which is watching these videos. So it's important to recognize that we have that and that it is a tool. We just have to be open and aware to it. And at the same time, because of the internet, we're not even aware of what that does to us. So we have to be kind of proactive in how we use our time, especially with the internet, and also retroactive at the same time, because we have to see, okay, I realize that I spent all this time doing what? How's that benefited me? Uh, if you're an iPhone user, I think most people get the screen report even just as a default setting, where once a week it'll tell you how many hours you spend a day on the iPhone, and it's amazing to see mine come back up. And even though I'd like to qualify this with I have to use my phone sometimes to study when I'm not at home, it's still amazing to know that I spend 2 hours a day on that thing. And, that's 2 hours, that's 10% of the day that I don't have. That's 10% of my time. And I had to be very proactive in how I spend that 10%. Is that just doing nothing, or is it benefiting me? Is it bringing me to where I want to go? And also reflecting on those lessons that I obtained through it has benefited me in the sense that I can actually feel the impact of them, and I know that they're important, because although I'm not as maybe exposed to social situations now, at least what I can do in spite of that is listen to better conversations, to listen to these podcasts, to listen to these experts talk about their books and their findings and all of that. And at least I can use that as a way to reflect on what I want and what they have done and see what I can learn from it. And with these experiences that people share, some of them are quite severe too. So you can actually find ones that resonate with you, whether it is that person's way of speaking, whether or not that person's in the same language that you speak in, or whether or not that person is as severe, maybe as a situation, maybe not as intense, maybe as intense, or maybe even more intense, and maybe that's the way you learn better. Or maybe that person has a more balanced approach, and you can see that this person's presuppositions allowed himself to reach his lessons. So maybe he had like almost the same experience. So maybe it is like you and him, let's say, are mentally the same. For argument's sake, let's say that. But you can see that his experience has been different in his past, but the situation was exactly the same. And he comes to these new conclusions, and then you wonder why. You could reflect on your own experience, why you came to those conclusions, and then you can compare and contrast and learn from that. Now, as we mentioned before, comparison can also be dangerous, especially when you compare likes. For instance, if you want to chase likes and you think, I have 100 likes, this person has a million, I'm a piece of shit, I'm a failure, just because you're comparing yourself to someone else's metrics or someone else's success, is not a good way to go about it. You should compare yourself to, at least as we say, as many people say, who you were yesterday, who you were before, and hope that you're moving in a positive direction, 1% better.
Let me ask you something about that language component where someone else might be experiencing life and maybe speaks a different language. Sometimes it still boggles my mind that we forget that people think in different languages. The voice in their head is speaking a language that we would not even recognize. And that's kind of mind blowing if you think about it. But do you think, based on sometimes the limitations or the ability to go even deeper with the way that language is just structured in some countries, do you think that either betters or hinders someone's reflection, right? Because when you're kind of looking back at an experience and you're thinking to yourself all the takeaways from it, by having maybe a language that is a little bit more sophisticated, does that allow you to get better outcomes and apply it in your life? And does that allow you to get better reflections that you can then take into a takeaway? I would even say the conversations that they maybe have with other people in conversation in their language around that same topic might give them significantly better takeaways. And is this the big advantage of learning new languages, is allowing yourself to tackle a challenge or an opportunity head on, but really go in from different perspectives? Because in many ways we're still limited by our language, right? Like even when I come out of an experience, I'm like, man, I can't explain it, but I try. And even then, I sometimes, as articulate as I try to be, I still feel like sometimes I don't do a good enough job sharing that feeling, right? Sometimes the language doesn't catch up to the feeling that you got. And there's a lot of empty spaces you leave out as a result of that. Do you think that makes a really big difference in the language that you speak in your mind?
I believe so, and especially that we have to consider that even when communicating experience, there's a lot that's filtered out. I believe that even language, even the voice you speak in your head, that is filtered from somewhere. So you have this organic sensory experience, or maybe it's not. Well, I would even argue your thoughts can be sensory as well, but you have that and you translate it into a language. So you translate it into language in your head. Then you have to translate it in the vocabulary you speak. Maybe your vocabulary is limited, or maybe you learned the words wrong, right? So there's also that filter. Then if you want to share that with someone, then you have to say it out loud. And then that gets translated or filtered by your tone of your voice, your speed of thinking, speed of saying it, your emotion behind your words, and your choice of words. Then that gets limited by the person's reception, by even the environment. Like, is it a loud environment? Is it uncomfortable? Because even that can change the perception of that, of whatever you're speaking, just from the same sensory input that they're receiving from the environment. Is the environment making them uncomfortable? Is it making them more open, more susceptible to receiving that information in that setting? And then you also have to be filtered out through that person's experiences as well, and your own experience as well when you're saying it, because maybe you're speaking through these maybe not traumas, but these lessons that you learned that can be negative or positive, and that's influencing how you say it, or influencing how you think about it, or even influencing how you experience it, because it can be bring up like past emotions. So then you also consider that for the other person. Maybe for them it's bringing up past emotions, and that's why they're experiencing it in a different way. Then you have to communicate it in a better, maybe not in a better way, but in a way that's more receptive to the way that you want to deliver it. And you have to learn how to do that with that person. And that comes from knowing the person, also judging their responses. So then it goes into their mind, into their language, and maybe that's not the primary language. So then there's also that. Then there also comes their education, and there's all this sorts of mess. And then once it finally hits them, then they also have to filter out all of this other emotional stuff, all of this cognitive stuff. And at the end of the day, it's like broken telephone. You don't actually know what the person hears. You can say that you said this. You can say that they heard you, but did they really? Did they actually hear everything you're saying? And on top of that, too, when we talk about different languages, different systems of communicating, there are way too many variables there. Like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe even sign language is a better way of communicating than English. Maybe to some people, especially visual learners, that is a better way. Kinetic learners as well. Maybe for people that are, audio listeners, they learn best from listening. They would prefer a verbal language, and especially since I'm used to that, I would prefer verbal language. So it's hard to say, and I would even argue that the more sophisticated language is, the more precise it can be. You can even think about within in the English language, when you go into your job or your place of employment, you have a specific jargon, and that makes things very specific. For instance, As a doctor, I can point out, like the different parts of your finger. Like you can just tell me, oh, your right finger hurts, but I could tell you, oh, it's your right, you know, proximal interphalangeal joint. And then I have a very specific language that you can derive from that, but you have to also know what I'm saying. So I had to say for me as well, I believe language is a huge part of it, and that's why it is important to know or be proficient in whatever language you speak in. And it's important to develop those skills and develop your vocabulary and learn how to express yourself in a better way. Even the words we choose, they're emotional. Like there's different words: dirty, filthy, unclean, unkempt. All of them have a different emotional way of hitting, and for each person it can be a completely different meaning.
Yeah, the level of filters that comes through bias and the attention level, I think it's so important. And I'm really glad you also added in the factor of your comfort level at that time that significantly changes the way that you express an idea, either to yourself or to another person. Like there has been far too many times I would say a story and I'd be like, man, I did not nearly say that story as well as I thought about it in my head. And like you realize that there was some level of nervousness of wanting to deliver that same story with the same excitement as you felt it, and you sometimes fall short as a result of that. This is why I'm a massive fan of repetition, the repetition and reflection, right? Which is the fact that even like, for example, you and I sit down and sometimes we revisit a topic multiple times. It may not be the exact same topic. It might be a topic that overlaps with the past topic that we talked about. So we need to kind of bring it back for context. And I love it every time, rather than stopping you halfway and saying like, hey, I've already heard that before. I always get excited because I always feel like if I missed a takeaway last time or something bold that you said, I like the fact that I get another chance to listen to it. And sometimes I find myself being even more attentive, trying to see like, did I miss something on the last time that you said it? So that to me gets really, really exciting. And, this podcast is a great example of repetition, is that I get to go back and re-listen to some of the things you said. Even in this moment right now, like there's a part of me that has to be on, ready to respond. There has to be a part of me that's reflecting in the midst of you speaking. But when I get to sit down and listen to it, it's kind of nice that I get to turn that part of me off and just take in everything you said in better detail. One of the things I really enjoy doing is listening to the playback and trying to find a quote that I want to bring into our Instagram post. And when I'm looking for this quote, I'm really paying attention. And sometimes I will like go back 10 or 15 seconds just to re-listen to you say that again, because I want to make sure that I got that statement right. And that part to me is the ones that hits the most. I don't know about you, man, but I have so many situations where I can't even listen to a whole song from beginning to end. And it got so awful that sometimes I'll sit down, I'm waiting for the second verse because it's my favorite part of the song. And like my mind drifts by the time we got to it. And then I'm like, crap, I didn't listen to it. And I'll start it over again, and over again. It takes me about 7 or 8 attempts sometimes to pay enough attention for that verse, even though that is my intention of why I rewind it. So it blows my mind how often we get distracted without even realizing it. But the opportunity you have to come back to it is where it gets quite significant. And this is why I'm such a big fan of documenting, right? The documenting component is a big piece. I've spoken at stages about the same theme and same topic so many times that I've become a fan of recording my own presentations and going back and reflecting through how it went. And in many ways, it kind of brings me the spirit and joy I've always had for incredible basketball players like Kobe Bryant, that was famously known for watching his tapes right after the game and learning how to get better from it. And he would watch it right after the game because it's fresh and he knows what's happening. And I would do that quite often because I'd always go back to how I could articulate things better. And over time, you kind of find patterns, right? You start finding like, hey, the fact that I explained it this way seemed to be falling a lot better than the other way. So I think I'm going to stick with this way. And you realize that as you start doing that, you actually start getting better in how you articulate things in your mind as well. How you think about the things that are the most significant to pull out, because you start realizing that this is what really resonated. So it becomes quite interesting when you think about the practice and the repetition that's going to really help with it, but also the undeniable attention that's required along the way. Through my reflections, Camille, I got to tell you, one of my biggest, and I would say one of the biggest takeaways from my reflections that I think completely changed my life was the moment that I realized that being weird is actually a strength and not a weakness, right? And to me, that took a long time to really understand, because when you think about being weird part being a weakness, in many ways, you also think of yourself as, like, what does weird mean, right? Is sometimes you're very different, you're sometimes very unique, and because of that, sometimes it doesn't get you the level of acceptance and validation that you were hoping to get from society, and you get a bit of a pushback from it. And I used to see that as a weakness, but once you realize that it's a strength, you really get comfortable with showing that side of your way. And sometimes it doesn't need to be extravagant. Like, you don't need to make a scene everywhere you go. But the fact that you can openly talk about something and not care if people don't respond to it the way you thought they would have responded to it, being okay with disagreeing, being okay with standing ground and not falling back just because someone is pushing back against it, and doing it for the reasons that really matter to you, like wanting to share that idea, not to get validation. When you start realizing that component, it really changed my life. And I've really started appreciating my unique being. Like, I realized even when I was out at Electric Island yesterday, like, I was not as extravagantly free spirited as some of the people were. I was not as jumpy in the dance floor as a lot of people were. I wasn't as loud with my colorful clothing as other people were, but I was very comfortable. I was very comfortable being someone that was just enjoying the moment and being there. I didn't feel the pressure of mirroring what other people were doing. As a matter of fact, I also embraced the fact that they're weird in their own way too. And when you start seeing weirdness as a strength, it really, really changed my whole perspective. I'd be curious from you, when you think about a reflection that you really can credit to being a big part of your personal growth, something that you felt like understanding this really changed your behavior and you never went back, or understanding this just really changed your way of thinking and you never came back. What can you credit when you think about that type of reflection in your life?
I think it goes back to the bad days and the reflections that I've had that changed me the most have always been that I avoid negative emotion, and by doing that, I chase different things, but I never chase success. It's always like I'm running away from failure, but never towards success. And I've had that realization a couple times in my life. It's just uh, it comes out in different ways, and it's not as apparent. So when I was addicted to alcohol or cigarette smoking or even opioids at one point, it was just about that avoiding that sense of boredom, that loneliness, that emptiness, and not actually driving towards the things that would make me feel fulfilled, make me feel part of something, give me that sense of belonging that I desired. Those are the things that I was missing internally, but instead of actually embracing the steps and the efforts that I needed to take to get there, I just wanted to avoid those feelings. So, recognizing, I think just reflecting back on that and seeing that thought pattern play out, and then seeing those patterns of being and the patterns of thinking, and then realizing, like, why am I doing this? Like, it's just I'm miserable, and I'm, for instance, I feel alone, yet I'm doing things to make myself not feel alone, but it's not actually helping me not be alone. It's it's just killing time and killing the emotion for that moment. So those are the types of reflections that I find most powerful, at least for my life, is that I'm being unconscious, and I'm not going towards the direction that will actually serve me well or the most.
That's such a powerful takeaway. And I think there's a lot of credit to some. I was mentioning this even earlier, but I don't think I went. I don't think I put a big enough asterisk. Is the benefit of reflecting sooner than later as well, right? Because the idea of trusting your memory with that experience that you're reflecting on, it starts deteriorating one day at a time, and even if it's in small percentages, by the time you revisit that memory, sometimes the memory isn't even close to being accurate to what it used to be. And sometimes your feelings about it has changed, right? Like I think there's a benefit in revisiting that memory at a recent time, especially if you're going through the emotion of that memory and really reflecting on what you can take out of it. Where when you come out on the other side and you're now out of the fire and you're reflecting back on it, you may not really dive into the takeaways as much because that feeling of why you wanted to get out of it is no longer there. And I think your reflection starts slightly changing based on what you can do there. So I get really interested in recent reflections, and I think this is also where there's been some benefit of us meeting up frequently or chatting frequently about something that maybe even happened yesterday. I like the fact that we kind of connect and see how we're doing, how our week's been, and it gives us an opportunity to throw an experience into the ring and we kind of just chop it down together, which gets exciting. But this is what I want to kind of define a little bit better. And it's going to require some thinking out loud because I haven't put enough thought in breaking this out verbally. And even though I think we know how to do it subconsciously, is the how component. How does one reflect, right? I've used the metaphor twice of going at it with a pickaxe. And I think about what that looks like in someone's process of trying to reflect back on a memory. There's a lot of things people have experienced in their life. Someone might experience something somewhere along the way and found this episode and said, hey, I actually want to go back to a past memory and do a little bit of that shadow work that's not always fun to do and pull something out of it that maybe I can bring into my life to make me better or dodge the next time that experience happens again. What do you think happens in that conversation? What do you think is going on in that level of reflection? And feel free to use any of your recent reflections that maybe you've done and maybe walk us through it. But I'd love to get a very, very slow breakdown of what you think you're doing to get the most out of that reflection.
It's difficult to say what's most effective because I find that as I get older, the more strategies I employ or deploy, rather, the more my mind changes to be used to them. So it feels like I have to employ new techniques. But I will say this, for me, understanding how the mind and how memory works and how emotions work, at least in a more objectively based system like the Western medicine approach, has helped when it comes to specific things. And to give you an example, how long term memory works. When you recall a memory, when you think back and remember something, what happens is you actually pull it out of your long term memory and you put it towards your working your active memory. And then when you do that, it deletes it from its long term memory. So you have it in that spot, and if it somehow disappears, and it can if you're severely deficient in protein or if you don't have enough energy and all these other different reasons, or you get brain damage, so many different factors that can happen. But let's say you keep it in your active memory, you can actually change your memories over time. And that's why brainwashing is possible. And that's why it's possible to gaslight people, and how it's possible to even work with people that have PTSD to reduce the severity of the emotions based on the memories that they've had. Is that you can work towards your memory to think about it in different ways, to notice things that you haven't noticed, or even implant things, or even decrease the severity of the emotion based on that stimulus that you had within that memory. And then you put it back in your long-term memory. So whenever you recall a memory, it essentially changes it. So you never remember the same experience twice. And that helps because now you have the power to change it. Now you have the power to change a traumatic experience. You have the power to change its hold over you and what you can do about it. And I think just the awareness of that is the first step. And for me, understanding how that works has been a huge way of being able to reflect and having that mindset of, breaking away from the patterns or learning from the memories that you had and to use them in a beneficial way. And then from there, I think now I'm reading more and more about Eastern philosophy about the mind, and I find it a more complete picture than the one we have in Western philosophy or in Western medicine, Western psychology. And I think, of course, they're parts of a whole, and they can never be dismissed one or the other. And learning more about that made me realize that there's still so much I don't know, and there's still so much that I can learn. And even within myself, being able to think back and pulling these memories out, what happens in my mind when I reflect is, especially on a memory that really has a hold on me or really has influenced me deeply or makes me still feel these certain emotions, the way I approach it is consciously. And if it's really bad, I will actually write down and journal. And that really does help in the sense that I have my intention. This is my intention. I want to think back in the memory and I want to understand why I feel this way. And when you talk about going at it with a pickaxe, it's about observing every detail and being like, why did it elicit, why did that elicit that emotion? Was it something from your past? And then trying to recognize your past and then trying to recognize the meaning behind that. So if you have the default of trying to look for the meaning behind things, then naturally I believe you're at an advantage in this stage. And that is because you're going to reflect on that and you're going to try to collect as much information as possible to see what fits and what doesn't fit. And when you see the incongruencies there, then you can abandon that theory and provide a new one. And then maybe your paradigm shifts. So instead of being like, I'm afraid of heights, and then I was at a height, and that's why I was afraid. Maybe you didn't realize that, you know what, you're afraid of heights, sure, but the reason you were afraid this time is because you had someone yelling at you. It could be something as silly as that. I know it's a ridiculous example, but if you recognize that you have these routines that you constantly put yourself through, and then you see it replay over and over, and the whole time you don't approach it consciously and trying to understand it because you're just trying to survive it, then there's really not much to be done. For me and for us in the way we approach it is to challenge our way of thinking, to challenge our biases, and to also understand them. Why were these strategies effective? Because your brain's not an idiot. Your brain, or your mind, I should say, developed these strategies for a reason because they worked. They worked to avoid negative emotion, but maybe it doesn't serve you now. So if you recognize that it worked before, then you could be more kind to yourself for adopting it. You could be more kind to it, and you can see the utility in it because maybe in the future it can still be useful. And then you could recognize the utility of the mindset you want to adopt, the one that you want to use to overcome this, or you can find the better way to approach things. And I think because naturally you and I are open to the idea that maybe we're wrong, or maybe there's a better way to do things. That's the way that we are able to pick at these emotions or pick at these memories so, effectively, so deeply.
The idea of the complexity of the mind is fascinating, man. When you think about parts of you that might have happened decades ago still making an impact on your behavior today, and you're not quite sure how because of all the complexities that it went through in order to do that, but also like how the right memory comes out at the right time or the right thought comes out at the right time. Like it's kind of beautiful how it learns and grows with you. And I think part of the process of dissecting and reflecting on these memories, what also becomes really, really helpful is that every single time you do it, you also gain the confidence subconsciously that you can do it more without actually breaking yourself, right? Some people are afraid of revisiting those memories because they're worried that it's going to mess them up. And when you learn to get through it, like your suggestion around the strategies that your brain creates, I feel like those strategies are starting to just really get fortified with the fact, with the belief that, hey, we've done it before, we can do it better. And I think that's where it gets really, really powerful. From my perspective, I was just thinking, and I think that the way that I reflect on memories is very similar to the way that I listen to an album for the first time. And last week we talked about how the Kanye West Donda album came out, and just since then, Drake finally released his album, Certified Lover Boy. So I've had the opportunity to do it twice, just recently, and I was thinking about the fact that, in fact, I thought about this after our conversation, is the fact that I do have a ritual of how I listen to albums, and I was actually more attentive towards it now that I was thinking about it. And I realized that what I first do is at the very beginning, I go through an album from beginning to end, right? Don't skip anything. Follow the order that it was meant to be done, and then go from beginning to end. And along the way, kind of think about what I liked and what I didn't like, what stood out to me, what didn't, what did I feel, how did I feel about it, and I just let it happen. There might be things that didn't really hit, but I'll still let it play. The things that really did hit, and I'll still let it play, and so forth. When I think about memories, I also think about that's the first stage that I go through. Like when I reflect back on something that happened, in order to really go at it with a pickaxe, I just first let the memory play. And I try to the best of my abilities to hold on to every detail of that memory. I try not to skip a stage of that memory. I try to go from beginning to end of every single thing that happens. And then as similar to the album, I try to pay attention to the parts that hit me different. Why did that one resonate a little bit more towards me? Why did that make me feel a certain way while the others didn't? Then when I go back to the album, the second time around, I go back to the songs that really hit me because I want to really give the album a fighting chance. Even if I didn't like the album, sometimes I start revisiting the ones I really like to think like, hey, maybe it's not as bad as I thought. So I go back and I revisit it a second time to think about, could this is the reason why this one hit me different. And I think about the fact that I do that with my reflections as well. After I've done going through it with a fine-tooth comb from beginning to end, I start paying attention to where I really felt impacted. And I really started going down that rabbit hole instead. If I went through a relationship and a breakup, I first play that relationship through my head, and then I think about the moments that I felt like was most significant in that memory, and I think about why was it the most significant. So now I'm going a little bit deeper. The final part of my album play is I started going on YouTube after, and I actually started looking at other people giving reviews or feedback about the album, and they're actually very, very smart individuals. Some of the people I find there blows my mind. You actually watch them do the first listen, and during the first listen, they'll pause it and they'd be like, "This guy just said this line," and then he'll explain to you why he said this line from his past albums. And I was like, "Wow!" He picked that up on the spot to a point where I thought he had a lyric sheet open in front of him. It's actually really fascinating how much these guys are able to pick on. To me, that gives me a new level of thinking about the album. It gives me a perspective where I think that, hey, I didn't catch on this lyric before, but now I understand why this connects to the rest of the album. And it kind of like becomes a beautiful, like a theater performance of like, now you really see how every act came together to be what it is. To me, when I reflect on memories, that is the equivalent of me sitting down with someone like you and having a review. Because what the review does with you is it gives me an opportunity to pick up on something that I might have missed based on the bias or the filters that I have. I think of the fact that you and I can sit down and watch the exact same Netflix episode, but we could come back with a very different perspective based on our upbringing and what we believe in or what matters to us. If it was an episode about something that happens maybe in a doctor's office, you might have picked up on some of the science, while I would have picked up on the aesthetics, right? Like we might have just come at it differently, where based on where our eyeball gravitates. And I talked about this in our previous chapter, where a very impressive statement that I heard from Jordan Peterson was about the emphasis he puts around what deep thinking is, and how it's actually very difficult to do deep thinking because it requires you to have a contradictory voice that pushes back on the things you believe in, to really give yourself the opportunity to figure out if this is the path you want to follow. By me being able to sit with someone like you, it gives me the opportunity to take in a new perspective on that memory. Similar to the album, it gives me a new perspective on the music that I didn't think about before. And I think that that level is it's only until I've done that that I really feel like I can let go. Because even after I beat at it multiple times and thought I got the most out of it, it's not until I really get a fresh set of eyes, more importantly, a fresh set of eyes that wasn't involved in that experience. So it really takes that emotional bias out of it and being able to get that perspective. And sometimes it'll be in the same page, sometimes it'll be very contradictory. But either way, I've now given it what I think is a fair opportunity to really squeeze that juice and see if I got everything out of it before I can shelf that memory. Now, I don't think that memory ever goes away. Even when we say let go, I don't think we're really letting go. But what I mean by letting go is that the lack of conclusion, the lack of closure that sometimes stops you from moving away from it. I think that part starts slowly disappearing when you give it enough time to rinse and repeat in order to get the most out of it.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that's the basis on most therapy now, is to have that objective person that's on your side. And I think that's what makes it very easy or very hard to find those people, because if you have someone that's not on your side and that will feed into the negativity, it's very easy to fall in the trap of making it worse. However, if you have someone that's completely open to you and wants the best for you, or at least wants to side with with the side of you that wants the best for you, that's when you can have a genuine, open conversation about these memories, and then that's what can help you find the things that are missing. Like you said, it's so hard to notice everything, especially the first time, because you're experiencing it for the first time. If you even recall that information, you have that added benefit of not being influenced by your need to take action or your emotions or that stimulus in general. And when you reflect on someone else and they've had a completely different life, because everyone has a unique life, they can come up with different things that they focused on, or different lessons that they've learned, or different situations that are similar, and come up, and you can be surprised with these new conclusions that you derive from that, because they're just a unique person with a unique perspective. And it's amazing to know that no matter how aware you are, no matter how mindful you are, you're going to miss something, and you're going to miss important information, and no one is ever truly enlightened. So that means that they're not completely removed from their own emotions, from their own experiences, their own teachings, their own traumas. In Vedic psychology, I'm reading a little bit about that now, and there's a term called samskaras, which is what is described as these kind of emotions that haven't been processed yet. It's almost like similar to a traumatic experience. However, it doesn't have to relate just to trauma. It can also be lessons you've learned. So that's why your mind, or as they call it, the buddhi, which is like Buddha but with an I at the end, not your actual like ass. You're not the booty, the buddhi. That is the cognitive piece, which actually is able to recall that and is responsible for that information that you recall that's relevant to the situation right now. And so when you have the two working in tandem, you can have these lessons that you pop up, but you can also have these undigested or unprocessed emotions come up that can hinder your progress or cause you to miss out information. How many times have you been so nervous and anxious that you haven't noticed, I don't know, the color on the wall? It can be important. Or how many videos have you seen that did you notice the guy in the monkey suit while everyone's playing basketball? There's You can be so blind to actually what's very apparent when you focus in on it, that you're naturally going to lose out on some information, and that information can be the reason why you're repeating the same patterns, or it can also be the piece that you need to free yourself. For instance, in my experience, especially with my experience around addictions, is I wasn't aware that I was addicted. And I know it sounds simple to people that haven't been addicted, that, you know, if you look from the outside, you can clearly tell. that this person has an issue. For instance, let's say a cigarette smoker who smokes cigarettes maybe like a pack a day, and they have to smoke cigarettes when they wake up and before they fall asleep. Yet they just see it as part of their identity and they don't see anything wrong with it, even though they've been constantly told that it's a health hazard, whatever, whatever. But if you're and they just see it as an addition to their life. But if you're from the outside, you can actually see, okay, this person one is doesn't realize that they're spending this money, and that's the reason why they're not able to afford these other things that they want to focus on, because they're spending money on cigarettes. Maybe it's not the case for everyone, but it can be for some people. Also, this person isn't living their most healthiest life, and maybe that's the reason why they're tired all the time, but they don't realize it. Maybe this is the reason why they're irritable all the time. They don't realize it. There's so much information that you can miss out on just because you're in that experience that other people can clearly see from the outside. And it's amazing when you have that shared experience, like listening to an album for the first time, when you can even find experts on YouTube, like people that, let's say in Drake's case, like are professional lyricists or are rappers that or are huge fans of him, so they know what he references or past albums, and they could draw that out and make that more conscious to you. It's important to recognize that people can be that resource for you. They can be the resource to shed that light, to give you that information on. It's important to select who you do that to, who you do that with, I should say, because it can be a negative one as well. And people can have biases, which can also influence how they receive that information and how they express their own information to you. And if you talk to someone that's bitter and has a lot of resentment towards, I don't know, dating, and then you try to find out why, or you share an experience of why you shared a particular experience with a person, and you're trying to understand if you were at fault, and you share it to that person, they most likely will never side with the other person, not give you the objective lens that you want, because it's so blinded by their own biases. And that's an important thing to recognize as well. And because it's so easy to tell in other people, but so hard to tell with yourself, once you recognize it in other people, you can say, and you can really ask yourself, what biases do I have that are like that, but I'm just not aware of? And I think that's where the challenge, the real growth begins, is recognizing, holy crap, I am a bundle of biases that I'm not even aware of. What are my blind spots? And to have the reflections make you aware of that is a very powerful tool, which I think is just it's almost impossible to recognize, but once you do, it's amazing what can happen from that.
As I'm hearing you break down the importance of sharing it with someone else, and more importantly, sharing it with people that may be the right people, as you said, people that are rooting for you at the end of the day, but still can give you an objective way of thinking. It started hitting me that I feel like Better Reflections is the bridge that connects better experiences and better conversations, right? It's the experience that you have, and then going and having conversations, be it in your head or with other people. That is, at the end of the day, the reflection that's happening through that experience. But if you don't have either, if you don't have the experience, the conversations feel a little empty and ill-knowledged. You don't have enough to really give yourself a good case. But then the other way around is, if you just have experiences but not the conversation that needs to be had around the experiences, you really lose out on the opportunity in order to take away the most from it. So it's really important to have both pillars. And I think you kind of set up what I think the next chapter will need to be about, which is better relationships. I think we need to get into that a bit more, because what's worth addressing is that something I tell you a lot off camera and off the microphone is the fact that I've never had a connection with someone like I have with you, which really gives me that level of comfort and critical thinking at a max when I speak with you. And I feel like that really turns up with you. And like I met you 7, 8 years ago. So I met you in my mid 20s, right? So when I think about I met you in my mid 20s, it took me a long time to come across someone like you. And we were lucky that we met because it was a very short instance where you and I were introduced and we stayed friends since then. But if that introduction didn't happen, who knows how much longer it would have happened. I think about if someone didn't have that, someone didn't have that Camille, someone didn't have that friend that they haven't had quite the opportunity to jump into. Maybe we could set up a little bit of better relationships for next week. But when you think about who to reflect with, what goes into consideration with who you think you can reflect with? You kind of identify the key component of someone that's rooting for you, because you're right, because there'll automatically be a bias if they're not rooting for you, that sometimes the objective way that's being shared with you is not necessarily to help you win out of that situation, but more because they don't want to see you win, right? There might be the level of jealousy or hatred or some level of bitterness that makes them not want to give you the idea that really would have made a difference. So therefore, you're actually being fed false or manipulated information that may really mess you up if you really take their credit to heart. So it scares me to think about you being able to put that much value in someone's opinion when they're not on your side. How does one find another Camille, right? Like, how does one find another person that have this undeniable trust with each other, that there is no hesitation in opening up about the ugliest memories and what that looks like? Because some people, you'll instantly, what I think will happen, will turn to their friends and think about who that friend is to them. Is that the right way to go? Because I'm not quite convinced that that may be the right way to go.
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing for me to think about too, especially if you're trying to reflect back to your friends as of now. And I have to say as well, I think the exact same way of you. Like it's amazing how much that we can grow just from our conversations and the fact that we're so comfortable and willing to share everything with each other. I think it comes from the fact that we have a mutual respect and admiration for each other, and the fact that the things I want out of life, I see you chasing, and I see you actively putting effort into, and being open and honest about your setbacks and how that influences you. And I think as well as guys, it's more difficult because talking about emotions it's just an uncomfortable experience, and we're taught from a young age that there's only like three or four people we open up to, our parents, maybe our best friend, and then maybe our partner. And it's almost seemed as effeminate if you talk about emotions and how they affect you. So it can be a bit more difficult, but I think for me, like the most important thing is, do I trust the person and are they honest? For the most part, uh, if I see someone that is telling a story of a time when I was there and I see them play it up and it's not for, let's say for humor's sake, it's more for bragging sake, that's usually a bad sign. I I look for people that I think have integrity, have are passionate in what they do, are taking active steps and putting effort into what they do, are chasing similar things. One that I respect, one that I admire. They have to be open and honest, and it has to be. There's naturally going to be a sense of judgment, but I find that what I respect more than that is that they're willing to almost forego their own judgment to understand. They have to have that curiosity and they have to have that patience and the understanding. And they have to be able to be questioning about the experience. If I hear someone talk contrary to my opinion, or if I express a better example, if I express an opinion that's unpopular to them, and the reaction is silence, or you know, being dismissive, or instantly uh, being quick to anger, then it's a bad sign. If I have someone on the other hand that asks questions and is genuinely trying to understand what's going on, I think that's one of the most important qualities, and that's something that you have definitely shared a lot with me, and I think it's apparent to a lot of people that you are curious about what is actually going on and what you can learn from that, and also if they've caught on to something that maybe you're not even aware of. So I think it's very difficult to say and break down exactly how you find that person. And I mean, at the same time too, it's so easy to screen it out. And if you really don't have that person, I honestly had to say that a therapist, and a good one as well, so you have to learn how to screen that, can be a substitute for that in the interim. But having that support system of that closest friend is very difficult to find and very difficult to have someone that is willing to be on your side. I think other good information that comes to my mind is how do you feel about sharing your failures or your setbacks, and how do you feel about sharing your wins and your success? If you're not able to share either and both, it has to be both. If it's one or the other, like I have this sense of feeling when I share my success with certain people that I'm bragging, and I feel so uncomfortable talking about that, so I don't, and I avoid that. And I realize that those are the people that I can't connect to on that level. And at the same time too, when I commiserate with other people, and I feel like I regret it, either because they could use it for as ammunition in the future, and some people have, or that they take it as an opportunity to share their experience in a way to make it about them, because like, oh, thanks, someone opened the door, now I can walk through it and just open up about my stuff and take away focus from me, and not recognize that I'm the one that initiated this because I need support and help with this, or just dismiss it, then that's also, like, those are the people that I don't want to do it. So there's a lot going on there.
You use the word feel so many times in that explanation. And I really do think that is the answer, which is sometimes why it's so hard to explain, right? It's how do you feel in the environment with who you're communicating these things with? And I have to tell you that suggestion of a therapist is brilliant. It didn't even cross my mind, but it makes complete sense. You're in an environment that is all about these reflections and communication and getting a different perspective on these things that leaves you feeling different and thinking different. I think that is a great substitute for someone who may not have that at the very beginning. I'm by no means an expert in this answer because, as I said, it took me a very long time to find someone like you. And we met by accident. I wasn't actively looking for someone to connect with for this purpose. But what you said along how you feel when you share a good story or bad story to someone is such a gem that I hope does not get overlooked, because a, a lot of that sometimes happens on friends, but imagine for the ones that it happens with that might be in a relationship, might be their significant other, right? Like I have had a relationship in the past where I would always play down my good days and play down my wins because my girl at that time, she just wasn't doing great things in life. She was very unhappy where she was, and she was constantly complaining. And imagine me coming in and saying, wow, I just got a promotion, or wow, I just had this amazing event. Like I would always play it down like it wasn't a big deal because of the fact that I felt guilty that it would hurt her by hearing that I'm doing well and she's not. And I didn't realize it back then. Talk about awareness. It's like you don't realize it back then, but through reflection, I was able to really get an understanding of how unhealthy that relationship is when you're closing a side of yourself due to the fact that someone would be bitter about you having a good day. Like imagine that. Like imagine what kind of a relationship that is. And in the circle of friends, I think it's very similar. But the good news is you can have multiple friends where you may not have multiple partners, and you could find multiple people. And as a matter of fact, you could trust different people with different things, right? For conversations around business, for example, I might go to one of my peers and I might actually open up to them because their knowledge and expertise of maybe a challenge that they overcame in the past might be far more beneficial than me opening up just to a friend. And I I think there's an opportunity to think about who'd be the best person to talk about X. And whatever that X is, it's going to allow you to kind of have a better direction. It's kind of interesting to think about who your mind gravitates to when you think about who the best person is to talk to about that situation. But it really, I think, when I think about our trust and where that came together, where we finally opened up, admittedly, I don't think it happened right away. I think it took us a few years to get to the level that we are now. But I think that we started dropping the doors of skepticism and like confusion and mistrust and all these things that usually comes with meeting a stranger for the first time. We started dropping them because we were opening up about things that weren't necessarily problems in our lives. We're just opening up about things that we're doing, right? Sometimes it was about working on our social cues and our social game and being able to create real meaningful connections and realizing that we have a very similar way of critical thinking. And actually, we were quite intrigued that you and I were already kind of reading the same stuff, even though we never talked about it. So that commonality came out of the fact that we were opening up about something that wasn't a make or break. Because, sometimes that skepticism comes with, will this person use that against me? Knowing that this can be used against me made it a lot easier to open up about those areas. And I think that gave us a level of traction. But I think where it really opened up is when we took a leap of faith to talk about some of the most challenging areas in our life. And I think for both of us, it came down to a relationship and a heartbreaking situation where, first and foremost, I was extremely flattered that I was the first person you decided to call when you were going through a difficult time in a past relationship. But at the same time, it's like I thought about why I'd be the first person you'd call. And I think many of that had to do with the fact that I've experienced something similar, but also the fact that we've gone through multiple scenarios of proof that there was no judgment on something going really wrong in our life. In fact, we would uplift each other and give support when we were in those situations. So I think it made sense in that manner. But to me, I remember that conversation very specifically because the conversation started with me not instantly taking jabs at the other person. I first wanted to make sure that you weren't being unfair based on the fact that you were emotional. And I remember that I was even like half defending her, saying, hey, what if this was the issue? What if this was the issue? But then after breaking the walls down a few times, we came down to like a common understanding of where things really went wrong. And that kind of evolved into deeper conversations and give us an opportunity to really throw in our darkest moments and really understand each other to another level. I think that's very, very hard to get into. The fact that I said we've been friends for like 8 years, I would say only in about the last maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe, that I think we really hit the ground running on the level of connection that we had. So again, I'm not an expert in this area, but I know it's possible when you start feeling like something is right with the individual that you're with. And when you get that gut feeling that something's not right, you really need to listen to it. Some people will throw in their stories to fit in, to seem like they have a life that's worth being part of, and to seem like they have to get that validation from the group that, hey, he or she is a me too. They've gone through it as well, so maybe they're part of the group as well. Don't make that mistake of putting out incredibly vulnerable stuff in your life based on the fact that you're trying to do it for validation. Do it for the fact that you're trying to get your objectives met of what you're really trying to get out of it. Because when you start doing it for that reason, you're not just going to carelessly throw it in every direction. Because number one, it doesn't get you the feeling that you're hoping to get. But number two, it's dangerous when you throw off to the wrong person. And like you said earlier, I have in many situations have seen things that happened to me in the past get thrown back at me. Now, fortunately, I'm kind of immune to it now because I've really passed it emotionally and I've really overcome. I've come to a point in my life where those things are very, very far distant memories and doesn't hurt me anymore. But it does get used against you because, as I heard in a recent Drake song, being that I've been jamming the album on repeat, he says, "No one prays for you when you're winning." And I thought, what a great line, right? No one prays for you when you're winning. And it's true. You think about the perspective of change when things are going good in your life. It's like you really lose that support because they think you have everything you need. And sometimes it goes down the other path of jealousy. And I think there's an opportunity here to also see it from that perspective is, can you find those few people in your life that would root for you even while you're winning? That would actually push you even while you're winning, not just when you're hurting and they want to seem like someone that was there for you in your hard times. Again, I like the fact that you use the word feeling a lot. I think that's a big part of recognizing if you're able to open up to that person. But as you also suggested very kindly, that having a therapist around is a really good substitute. And I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, you know what? You're the way that you were describing all that made me think as well of the fact that we we share these things with the people that we feel safe with, and most of the time, it does feel like it's almost out of validation, kind of. Uh, I can share this with you because of our connection, and while that is the case, it can end up being something wrong in the sense that when you surround yourself with people that only agree with you because they're taking the path of minimal resistance, for example, yes men, right? Those are the people that don't really contribute much to your positive benefit. They're only there for whatever purpose that they derive, which you'll never find out because they'll never tell you because they're never open and honest and upfront about that with you. And having having those people makes it very difficult because they just will feed into your biases and will create those feedback loops that you feed onto yourself stronger without challenging them. And it's important to have someone that you trust that can challenge them in a genuine way and in a kind and respectful way for your own positive benefit. That is the main thing. And all too often, I find that people will just say yes to anything you say just for the fact that they want to fit in with you, or that they do that because they don't want to. Maybe they don't want to spend the energy. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they have all these other reasons that I'm not aware of because I'm not them. But the way it seems is that that's way too commonplace. So what I find is people that disagree with me, I tend to get excited. And of course, it depends because I can also get really nervous and intimidated. But that is the opportunity to find someone genuine. And I think that's the main criteria for me is someone genuine. Someone that is willing to put forth their experience, their thoughts, their feelings when I say something. Because naturally, when people speak to me, or when we're in any kind of conversation, if we're present in the moment and we're listening to the other person, you're naturally, your mind's naturally going to come up with a response, a natural curiosity, if you allow it to, and if you're not distracted. And those people that can do that and then express it, even without fear of that disagreement and without that confrontation, even though it doesn't have to be, I think those are the people that I want to align myself with, especially when it comes to these situations, that I can trust that when I reflect on things that I'll get a whole unique perspective, which is most of the time the reason why I want to do it. And all too often as well, we want to share these experiences just to have someone to vent to or just so we can throw it out there. But I also really enjoy people that can reorganize it in a way that challenges me. And I think that a lot of people are craving that too. It's just they're not aware of it, especially because the way it's done is what some people would call being brutally honest or being blunt. And that's not the right approach either, to be completely dismissive of someone else's emotions and someone else's experiences and be like, oh, you'll get over it. Or throwing certain cliches, which I agree with you. I get intrigued from the origin of cliches, but there are certain cliches like it is what it is, I cannot stand. I feel like that is the laziest way to converse with someone. That's whenever someone says it is what it is, that's usually the end of the conversation. Well, I'm having a terrible day. It is what it is. What happens then? You can't refute it is what it is because it is what it is. But tell me something, right? put something forth in that conversation, or at least anything. I would prefer silence over that, because having that cliche almost denies the responsibility of the conversation, almost denies the other person of what they want. And I think it's so easy to be so dismissive, and that's probably why a lot of people have difficulty finding people that can be on their side, because of that, of being dismissive within conversations, of finding people that will just say yes because they're taking the path of minimal resistance. And I think finding people that want to put effort in, that is really a good sign that you're in the right direction, or that you found someone that can have potential for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a two-way relationship as well, right? Because sometimes, in the defense of the recipient of that story, if they don't have that relationship with you, they will probably be dismissive because of the discomfort of the dark story, or the strange outcome that you may be trying to reflect on, that they have no interest in. And if you don't believe me, like, approach 10 strangers and just drop your darkest stories on them, and
Oh, I
see what
have.
kind of reaction you get, and it'll be very, very evident that they just weren't ready for it. And guess what? That's not their fault. Relationship is work. You got to make that relationship and get it to a level where both parties feel comfortable throwing ideas into the ring and receiving ideas from the ring. And when you have that type of relationship, you really can dive in a bit deeper on reflections. But we're gonna save that one for next chapter, because I think there's so much we could talk about with relationships more than anything else. So I'm really excited to talk about that as well. At the end of the day, I think about one of the biggest parts of my personal development journey, and I really think about the fact that majority of it came down to the fact that I was paying attention to some of the things that happened to me in order to redirect the sales in my journey. And I think about how many times I could have not redirected it based on the fact that I was going on autopilot. No matter what it is, like, there's so much wisdom out there in the world that you could really take that into your reflections and make life decisions with it and really change your perspective. And sometimes, without you even realizing it, your actions are modifying and changing behavior, and you're acting differently, and all of a sudden you feel good about the way that new way of coming gets. I really like your perspective on the lack of judgment that's necessary in these conversations, right? And that's a big part of having that openness, because a lack of judgment, I think, is everything in that scenario. It's like, you really need to understand how little you know about this world and the people that are in it, and how everyone has such a different outlook, that if you don't have that perspective, you're going to be very closed-minded, because who gives you the right to know what is right or wrong based on living a single life of your experiences, especially when you're younger, like, you haven't even lived a long life, and all of a sudden you think you know it all. I was at Electric Island yesterday. There was a song that was playing, and it was a very simple song with simple lyrics, and I don't even know the name of it, but the line was that, if I jumped off the edge of everything I know, will I ever come back the same again? And I thought that was such a beautiful statement in that song. The idea that once you move past everything you think you know and you see what's out there, the fact that you realize that you know nothing, like a minuscule of the knowledge that's in this world, how can you ever have that judgment on other people for what they know and what they believe in? It gives you instant humility. And I hope that through multiple reflections based on not only your experience, but other people's experience, I really hope that people do see that other people had very different experiences, and that's why they are the way they are. And it earns them that respect to be able to understand that there's so much more in this world that they can learn if they start paying more attention. And again, it comes down to the beauty of the fact that there are endless knowledge available at your fingertips. The mobile device is quite fascinating. You even think of the dating apps. Take the app out of the equation, and you're literally tapping on this glass in a certain pattern that results in another individual coming and meeting with you in person. Like, if you just take in the fascination of being able to create meaningful relationships by spending time in the right places with the right conversations, you're giving yourself the endless opportunity that you need to find a friendship like what you and I have, to give you those endless opportunities for personal growth every step of the way. Camille, before I get your final thoughts on reflection as we wrap up today's chapter, I want to just very quickly thank everyone for listening to this incredible conversation. Yet another fascinating one in our book of modern mindset and having better life. I'm really excited to see where this one keeps growing. But for any of you that listen to this episode, whether you're watching it on our YouTube live stream or the replay of our episode, do us a favor and hit that like and subscribe button so that you help the magical algorithm world of YouTube and help us get found by other people that may also benefit from the value that we're sharing these episodes. And if you're listening to us on an audio streaming platform, be it Spotify, iTunes, Google Music, whatever it is, do give us a favor and hit the subscribe button so that you're the first to know every single time we drop an audio episode. And if you do really feel the value of this episode and you want to leave us a review, please do that on Apple iTunes, because we are making it a mission of checking our iTunes account every single week to see if there's a new review. And we're going to be thrilled to read your reviews live on these episodes and give you a shout out, just our way of showing gratitude for the time that you put in to let us know what you feel about these episodes. Camille, it's an honor. It's an absolute privilege. I can't think of anyone else I'd rather be doing this show with. And I want to thank you again for joining me. But when you think of better reflections and think of the 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people that may listen to this episode one day, what are some things that they could do today to start having better reflections and grow through it?
Well, thank you. That's high praise. I I think it stems from our conversation from last week, which is better awareness, is being present within the moment, and even being present of when you recall these experiences that you've had, and being aware of your biases and how your mind works, how your individual mind works. And that can come from realizing that you have these unresolved issues or these unprocessed emotions, and how to work through that can be through having these better conversations, as we discussed as well, a couple techniques with that, and being open to the idea that you can be wrong, and recognizing that everyone knows something, and some people will be able to tell you things about yourself that you aren't aware of. To have that objective feedback does help a lot. And I think as well, recognizing how the mind works does play a huge factor in some people, especially the people that are into the finer details. And also being able to be curious, being aggressively curious of why these things are happening, and wanting change, and putting yourself in the right situation, and having these better conversations will allow you to do so, and actively searching for maybe people with similar experiences, and using tools as the internet, podcasts, videos, and your friends, therapists. You have so many resources at your disposal to use that can help you reflect on the situations in an objective way. So I think those are some of the tools that I would use, and you've described a lot as well. And once again, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for doing this every week. I really enjoy our conversations together, so I'm glad that we got a good one going here.
In the spirit of better reflections, I'm excited to reflect back on this episode, man. I think there's so much value shared in here, and it also makes you very, very observant of a lot of the behaviors that we have that we don't sometimes put into words unless we get on a mic like this, right? And we start like dissecting what we're actually doing in the process. Like, it made me reflect back on how we became friends. It made me reflect back on how I reflect. It's actually quite fascinating when you start having these conversations, how much it helped me grow. Brother, every episode, one episode at a time, I feel myself growing and getting 1% better every single episode, if not way, way larger than 1%. And I can't thank you enough for being my fellow co-host on this incredible show. I'm excited to come back next week. Camille, as always, thank you for joining. And for all of you listening, I hope you have an incredible night. I hope you have a fantastic Labor Day and a great start to the new week. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. Everyone, have a good night. We'll see you again soon. Take care.